In the quiet stretch of a late evening in Meridian, Idaho, a pharmacy parking lot sat under ordinary lights. Cars came and went. People picked up prescriptions. The night looked like any other night. But a few lives were already moving toward a point they could not return from. There was a husband who believed his marriage was slipping away. There was a wife carrying more secrets than one person could comfortably hold. And there was a young attorney, a father, a man whose choices had placed him in the center of another family's pain. What happened that night would not begin in the parking lot. It began months earlier, in an office, with a new job, a private attraction, and the slow unraveling of boundaries that many people around them did not yet understand. By the time the truth came into the open, two families would be changed. One man would be gone, another would stand trial, and a woman named Kandi Hall would become one of the central witnesses in a story built from love, secrecy, anger, grief, and consequences. Tonight, we are going to move through this case carefully, not for shock, not for spectacle, but to understand how ordinary decisions, made quietly over time, can gather weight until one night becomes the night everyone remembers. Welcome back. Tonight's true crime story takes us to Meridian, Idaho, and to a case involving Kandi Hall, Emmett Corrigan, and Robert Hall. This episode is written for calm nighttime listening. The facts are real, but the tone will stay steady and respectful. There will be no graphic descriptions, no sudden turns, and no sensational framing. This is a story about a relationship that crossed lines, a marriage under strain, a confrontation in a public place, and the long legal process that followed. So, settle in, lower the brightness of your screen, and let the story unfold at an easy pace. In 2010, Kandi Hall was looking for work. She had experience as a paralegal, and according to the Idaho Supreme Court's later summary of the case, she was introduced to Emmett Corrigan through a mutual friend. Emmett was waiting to learn whether he had passed the bar exam. He wanted to open his own law office, and he needed help from someone with legal office experience. Kandi was older than Emmett. She was married to Robert Hall, known as Rob. Together, Kandi and Rob had a long marriage and children. Their home life, like many home lives, had layers that outsiders could not fully see. Emmett Corrigan was also married. His wife was Ashley. They had children, and at the time of his death, Emmett was remembered in court as a father whose absence left a deep wound in his family. Local reporting from the sentencing hearing described the emotional impact on Ashley and the children, who had to face the loss of their father at very young ages. When Kandi and Emmett first met, their connection moved quickly. The court record says that they were attracted to each other almost immediately, and within 2 weeks, they began a sexual relationship. Later, after Emmett passed the bar exam, he hired Kandi to work for him in November 2010. That decision placed their private relationship inside a professional setting, where the lines between work and secrecy became more complicated. For a time, much of the affair remained hidden. From the outside, there were still families, routines, jobs, errands, children, and evenings at home. But beneath the surface, Kandi and Emmett were living with a secret that affected more than just the two of them. In true crime stories, there is often a moment that feels like the beginning. But in real life, beginnings are rarely clean. They are usually gradual. A conversation, a decision, a message, a meeting, a lie told to avoid a harder truth. This case was not only about the final confrontation, it was also about the months before it. By early 2011, Rob Hall had reasons to suspect that something was wrong. According to local reporting during the trial, prosecutors pointed to an email from January 2011 that suggested Rob knew about the affair before the night of the shooting. even though Kandi testified that she did not think he knew until that day.
That disagreement mattered.
It mattered because the prosecution and defense would later tell very different stories about Rob's state of mind. The prosecution would argue that Rob armed himself, went to the parking lot, and waited for a confrontation. The defense would argue that Rob acted in self-defense during a chaotic encounter, and that he did not clearly remember what happened. Between those two versions sat the person who had been closest to both men that night, Kandi Hall. March 11th, 2011 was a Friday. By evening, the relationships at the center of this story were already tense. According to the court's factual summary, Kandi left work around 6 p.m. and returned home. There, she found Rob in the garage packing boxes. He told her he had reached a breaking point with the way their relationship had felt over the previous months. The conversation between them was difficult. Kandi admitted to an affair, though the details she gave in that moment did not remain consistent. Rob left the house around 8:45 p.m., and Kandi left shortly after. As she backed out of the driveway, she spoke with Emmett by phone. She told him she was going to a pharmacy to pick up a prescription. Emmett said he would meet her there. Emmett also had conflict at home that evening. The court record says that when he arrived at his own home, his wife confronted him about their marital problems. At some point, he left, telling her he had to pick up a prescription. Kandi went to the pharmacy. Emmett arrived too. After Kandi picked up her prescription, she got into Emmett's vehicle. The two drove away for a time. Later, they returned toward the pharmacy parking lot. Meanwhile, Kandi's older daughter had noticed Kandi's car at the pharmacy and wondered where she was. She called Kandi, and when she did not get an answer, she called Rob. That small family concern became part of the chain of events that brought everyone back together. As Emmett and Kandi drove back toward the pharmacy, Kandi received a call from Rob. According to Kandi's testimony, as summarized by the court, Emmett took her phone and spoke to Rob directly. Kandi described Emmett's tone as aggressive and challenging. The court record includes Kandi's account that Emmett made a threat during that call and told Rob to wait there. Soon after, Emmett drove into the pharmacy parking lot. Rob was there. The parking lot was public, but the conflict was intensely private. 3 people stood at the center of months of secrecy and pain. Kandi was the only direct eyewitness to the moments that followed, and the court later noted that she had given different accounts before trial and during trial. There was an argument. There was a physical confrontation, and then, in a matter of moments, Emmett Corrigan was fatally shot. Rob Hall was also injured during the confrontation. Later, he would say he did not remember the shooting itself. His defense would argue self-defense, while prosecutors argued that he had gone to the parking lot prepared for the confrontation. The ordinary parking lot became a crime scene. For Emmett's family, the news was devastating. For Rob's family, life also changed immediately. And for Kandi, the secret at the center of the story was no longer private. It was now part of a criminal investigation. After the shooting, investigators began piecing together the final hours of Emmett Corrigan's life. They looked at phone calls, they looked at timelines, they looked at who knew what and when. They also had to understand the relationship between Kandi and Emmett. By then, the affair was not just background information. It was central to motive, state of mind, and the arguments both sides would eventually make in court. Rob Hall was charged in connection with Emmett's death. At trial, the state argued that Rob knew about the affair and confronted Emmett with a firearm. Local reporting from the trial said prosecutors alleged Rob confronted Emmett in the parking lot on March 11, 2011, after knowing his wife and Emmett were involved. Kandi's testimony became a major focus. She testified that the men argued and that Emmett pushed Rob. She said she turned away and heard shots, but prosecutors challenged her account, pointing to differences between what she said in court and what she had previously told police. That is one of the quiet difficulties of this case. There was no simple, perfectly clean version of the final moments. The person closest to the confrontation had her own history, her own emotions, and her own relationship to both men. The court record later reflected the trial judge's concern about the number of conflicting statements Kandi had made. The defense leaned into uncertainty. Rob Hall said he could not remember the shooting. He said Emmett shoved him and that the confrontation escalated. His attorneys argued that if Rob fired the fatal shots, he did so in self-defense. The prosecution told a different story. They argued that Rob had time to think. They argued that he came to the parking lot with a weapon and waited. They did not frame the shooting as an unpredictable accident, but as the result of anger and preparation. The jury had to decide what the evidence proved, not what the affair meant morally, not whether the people involved had made painful choices, not whether anyone deserved heartbreak. The legal question was whether Rob Hall was guilty of murder, and whether his claim of self-defense created reasonable doubt. After hearing the evidence, the jury found Rob Hall guilty of second-degree murder. Later, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison, with parole eligibility after serving 17.5 years, according to the Idaho Statesman's reporting from the sentencing hearing. The trial did not heal the families. Trials can answer legal questions, but they cannot restore what has been lost. In court, Emmett's wife, Ashley, spoke about the impact of his death on their family. The Idaho Statesman reported that she described the sudden destruction of the life she had known with their children. The sentencing hearing was emotional, with family and friends present on both sides. The meeter was Lance Brace's family and quiet tributers to groan. Rob Hall apologized in court for the damage caused to both families, though he continued to say he did not remember the shooting itself. The judge told him that whatever conflict existed between him and Emmett should never have ended in death. Kandi was not present at that sentencing hearing. According to the same reporting, at the time, she was in an Idaho Department of Correction retained jurisdiction program for an unrelated grand theft case involving more than $30,000 from a former employer. Rob appealed his conviction. The central issue on appeal was whether the trial court had properly instructed the jury on self-defense. In 2016, the Idaho Supreme Court held that the jury instructions were proper and affirmed the conviction. That decision meant the legal outcome remained in place, but outside the legal record, the case continued to live in the lives of the people connected to it. There were children who had to grow up with the story. There were parents who had to carry the loss of a son. There was a widow who had to rebuild after public betrayal and private grief. There were 2 daughters of Rob and Kandi Hall whose family was also permanently changed. True crime often focuses on the moment of violence, but the longer story is usually about the years afterward, the birthdays missed, the questions that come later, the court documents that remain after the people involved have tried to move forward, the way one night becomes a permanent dividing line. Before the case of Kandi Hall, Emmett Corrigan, and Rob Hall is not unsolved. There was an investigation. There was a trial. There was a conviction. There was an appeal. And the conviction was affirmed. But even solved cases can leave behind questions that do not fit neatly inside a verdict. How does a private betrayal become a public tragedy? How many chances were there for someone to step away, tell the truth, end the secrecy, or choose silence over confrontation? And how many people pay for decisions they did not make? Emmett Corrigan was a husband, a father, and a young attorney. He also made choices that hurt the people closest to him. Kandi Hall was a wife, a mother, and a paralegal who became involved with her employer. Her testimony became central to the trial, but her own actions and contradictions also became part of the public record. Rob Hall was a husband who claimed he could not remember the fatal moment and argued self-defense. A jury rejected that defense and found him guilty of second-degree murder. No one in this story is helped by turning it into a simple tale. It is not simple. It is a story about secrecy and anger, about marriages under pressure, about a professional boundary crossed, about a confrontation that should have ended with words, distance, or police intervention, but instead ended with a man's death. In the quiet after the trial, the pharmacy parking lot returned to normal. Cars came and went again. People walked in under the lights. Prescriptions were picked up. Receipts were folded into pockets. The ordinary world continued. But for the families connected to that night, ordinary life had been broken. And that is what remains. Not the headlines. Not the television retellings. Not the courtroom arguments alone. What remains is the reminder that hidden choices are rarely hidden forever. And when the truth finally arrives, it can arrive with a weight far heavier than anyone expected. Thank you for listening. Tonight's case was the story of Kandi Hall, Emmett Corrigan, and Robert Hall, a real case from Meridian, Idaho, involving an affair, a fatal confrontation, and a conviction that was later upheld by the Idaho Supreme Court. Rest easy. Take care of yourself. And join me again for another calm, true crime story told slowly, respectfully, and with the lights low.